Hello, welcome to Musing Heavy, the site devoted to alternative reflections on hard rock and heavy metal. My name is Stephen Meyer, and we're doing part 3 of my series on the underrated fallacy, right? And in a nutshell, what I'm exploring in this series is that in our excitement to champion the bands that we like the best, we often make claims that this band is so underrated or this band is so underappreciated and they deserve a much bigger audience than they currently have, or more people need to know about the genius of this band than currently is the case. But once I started thinking about this in a little more detail, I realized these types of statements really don't hold water in most cases. They're not logical. And I'm certainly as guilty as anybody for wanting to talk up my favorite bands, especially the ones that don't get the publicity that others might. But really, most heavy bands are rated probably where they should be, right? And so in this particular episode, I'm going to concentrate on foundational heavy bands. So those could be bands that have been absolutely crucial in the development of heavy metal, say in the early 70s, and hard rock, proto-metal bands in some respects. Or this could also be bands that are foundationally important in specific subgenres of heavy music. You know, bands that were really important, say, for death metal or what have you, right? Or certain eras, you might say too. Okay? And the band that I'm going to concentrate on the most in this particular section is Budgie. Okay, so I guess one of the central arguments I'll be making in this section, and where it links to the entire series, is that just because a band is foundationally important, that they were a crucial building block, say, in the development of heavy music, or as I say, specific subgenres, just because they're foundationally important, doesn't mean that they're necessarily underrated if they have a small audience. Okay. I mean, some foundational bands are frankly musicians' bands that other artists certainly appreciate them, but they're lost on the mainstream, right? So we're going to explore the situation with Budgie, and we're going to link that with that overall sort of thesis that I have. Okay. And as always, you can view the entire paper in text form by following the links below. Okay, so who appreciates foundational bands? There are a collection of bands widely recognized as crucial building blocks for heavy music in general. Now, these are ones that everyone's going to agree on, I'm sure, but bands such as Black Sabbath, Led Zeppelin, Deep Purple, Judas Priest, and certainly you could name a few others that almost everyone's going to agree with. Or like I say, there are bands that are considered crucial building blocks in specific genres. So let's say if you're talking about thrash metal, inevitably you're going to list Metallica as important, as a very important pioneering band in that genre. Certainly Slayer and Anthrax and Megadeth would probably be mentioned as well. If you're talking about black metal, right, then inevitably, again, you're going to list bands such as Venom, Bathory, Celtic Frost, probably Merciful Fate as incredibly important in the foundation of black metal, and so on and so on and so on, right? And these are all bands, at least in terms of the genres I'm talking about, that are going to be fairly well known to people who listen to this type of music and probably get quite a bit of acclaim, or at least are fairly popular with the people who should know, you might say, right? But then there are other acts cited by the experts and more zealous enthusiasts, which I guess I would probably be, as also being crucially foundational, but which seem to be perpetually overlooked by the typical music fan, right? And so such grave injustices, in big quotation marks, often instigate more than enough reason for the underrated tag, right? Even if, again, if we study this a little closer, it's probably inappropriate, right? Budgie's an excellent example. This group is routinely labeled as underappreciated, particularly in consideration of their foundational value to heavy music. And there's no question Budgie is a foundational band in heavy rock and indeed heavy metal, right? They're certainly one of my all-time favorite bands, no question about that, right? And I am regularly tempted to talk them up because I just think they're so great. And, you know, I really enjoy their music and I want other people to clue into Budgie. But upon closer inspection, the fact that they are relatively anonymous to most people, certainly they're anonymous to the mainstream, and they're even oblivious to a whole lot of metal fans, right? That's probably about right. That's probably completely justified given the type of music that Budgie plays, even though they're incredibly important as a foundational band. Okay, so let's dig into Budgie a little more. For people who don't know, Budgie was a UK band that incorporated several seemingly disparate styles to great effect. So they took a lot of different styles and they put them all together. And styles that you wouldn't think would work together, somehow Budgie did make it work. So they incorporated the heaviness of, say, Black Sabbath, the light and shade of something like Led Zeppelin, and they were a power trio, and they had very strong progressive tendencies, not unlike some of the things early Rush did, right? But beyond that, Budgie was very quirky, right? A very peculiar band in a lot of ways. I would say quite a bit more quirky than, say, Sabbath or Zeppelin or Rush, right? And to get an indication of this band's sense of humor and quirkiness, all you got to do is have a look at some of their song titles. That would give you a really good indication. And I've listed a few in the essay here. So, You Are the Biggest Thing Since Powdered Milk. Nude, Disintegrating, Parachutist Woman. Yes, indeed. These are all songs and they're actually very good. Napoleon, Bona, Part 1, and indeed Part 2. Hot as a Docker's Armpit. Don't Dilute the Water. And Lies of Jim, the E-Type Lover, right? And these would be good examples, and believe me, there's many more. Even the moniker, the name Budgie, was chosen to deliberately raise some eyebrows. Although a lot of people never really understood the irony of what the band was trying to do. You know, you got a band that's this heavy, and they're named after this innocent little bird, a budgie, right? So again, a lot of people didn't quite get the sense of humor there either. Singer, bassist, and chief songwriter Burke Shelley was always the constant figure throughout the band's crucial run from 1971 to 1982. So Budgie's main run was really just a little over a decade. And then Burke Shelley led sporadic endeavors in the 1990s and beyond. Okay, so in addition to Burke Shelley, co-founder Tony Borge on guitar, who was later replaced by Big John Thomas, and longtime drummer Steve Williams were amongst the most noteworthy members to cycle through the ranks. And actually, I prepared a little figure that'll help us understand Budgie even a little more in this context. And what I did, you know, you can see their discography. They don't have that many albums, really. But what I did is I organized them based on what would seem to be foundational importance, because that's really what I'm trying to emphasize here. Budgie was a very important foundational band, even though they weren't popular, at least not mainstream popular. And I've organized their albums based on those that I think were especially foundational. And really, it's the early material where Budgie probably has the most influence, to a large degree on other artists, but also to a small subset of fans that understood this band. So we're talking 1971, 72, 73, 74, and 75. So Budgie starts quite early, right? Remember, Black Sabbath's first album was released in 1970. So Budgie's a contemporary, right? So you've got the first Budgie album, you got Squawk in 1972, you got Never Turn Your Back on a Friend in 73, you've got In for the Kill in 74, and Bandolier in 75. I think all of these albums are really important from a foundational standpoint. If I were to cherry pick a couple that are, you know, comparatively a little more well-known, I guess you could say, it would be the third one, Never Turn Your Back on a Friend, and the fifth one, Bandolier, right? And so As always, you've got on vocals and bass, Burke Shelley. You got it in this era, you got Tony Borge on guitar. And they had a few drummers, all of them actually really great. Ray Phillips played on the first three. Pete Boot plays on the fourth one, In for the Kill, just that one. And then Steve Williams begins his career with Budgie on 1975's Bandolier. And then he's pretty consistently the Budgie drummer from here on out after that, with a few interruptions here and there, right? And then the next two albums, released in 1976 and 1978, are arguably foundational. I mean, I think you could probably make the argument for or against here. Budgie's sound was changing a little bit. They weren't quite as heavy at this point, right? So they probably had some influence, but I don't think near the influence of the first five. So we're talking about If I'd Britannia, I'd Waive the Rules. I mean, you got to love their titles. And Impeccable, right? So arguably foundational, but I wouldn't say not nearly as influential as the first five. Not to say they weren't good albums, because they're all great albums. And then by the time we get into the 80s, Budgie connects with the new wave of British heavy metal, right? And this is where John Thomas, Big John Thomas, or JT, takes over on guitar. And he actually changes the direction of the band quite a bit. Both John Thomas and Tony Borge were incredibly great guitar players. But Budgie is actually, they still sound like Budgie, but there's actually quite a shift in style. And it coincides really nicely with the new wave of British heavy metal, which was a really important movement in the late 70s, early 80s. And Budgie was sort of connected with that. So I'm kind of calling this foundational in a way that it was foundational to that particular movement. I wouldn't say Budgie was a huge influence there. I mean, the biggest bands that came out of the new wave of British heavy metal were like Iron Maiden, Def Leppard, Saxon, Venom, Motorhead, these types of bands. But Budgie was connected with it. Anyway, we've got three albums from this era that maybe are somewhat foundational in a different context. So you got Power Supply, you got Night Flight, and you got Deliver Us from Evil. There were other mini albums and EPs and singles. I'm not listing those or live albums or compilations. I'm just looking at just for illustration, the official studio albums. And then Budgie more or less stops being a going concern after Deliver Us from Evil. And after that, they reform here and there, do mini tours once in a while, actually sometimes with different lineups, always with Burke Shelley though. And they only managed to release one more studio album, You're All Living in Cuckoo Land, another great title there. You've still got Burke Shelley and Steve Williams, but Simon Lees takes over on guitar. And yeah, Simon Lees carries on the tradition of yet another really good guitar player in the band, right? So that's sort of how I see Budgie in terms of where their foundational importance really lies. And it's definitely with the early stuff and maybe arguably some of the later stuff as well. All right, so going back to the essay. Okay, so Budgie played primarily in Europe, but they did have periodical excursions to North America and elsewhere. Often Budgie toured as an opening act for, of course, bigger bands. But they did headline quite a bit too. And when they headlined, they were capable of creating enough buzz to fill small concert venues or larger bars in selected locations. So they were never super popular on the touring circuit. They weren't filling big arenas or anything like that. But my understanding is, from what I've read, they were always well received as an opening act. And in smaller venues, they did well as an opening act, right? Their albums sold respectively. Again, considering the heaviness of the band and also their inherent quirkiness. So it's actually amazing. Probably they sold as much as they did, right? Yet the band never came close to reaching the commercial and acclaimed heights of their far more popular peers, right? So whether that be contemporaries such as Black Sabbath, Deep Purple, Zeppelin, or even Uriah Heep, they never got close to that stature, if you like, even though I would argue, and a lot of other people who know Budgie would say that they were incredibly important as a foundational band. And certainly other artists thought that. I mean, they were covered by Metallica, which we'll get to in just a second. They were covered by Iron Maiden. Megadeth was a big fan of Budgie. Soundgarden covered them. So these are some pretty heavy, heavy hitters in the heavy world, and they were Budgie fans, but they never were, a mainstream band in any way, shape, or form. Not like their original contemporaries, and they never emerged to the same heights as the leaders of the new wave of British heavy metal either, even though they were associated with the movement. So they never got as big as Iron Maiden or Def Leppard or Motorhead or anything like that either. In fact, Metallica's covering of Budgie's Bread Fan and Crash Course in Brain Surgery, another great title there, is for many heavy fans the only thing that kept the band from being almost completely buried in time. I mean, if Metallica wouldn't have covered them, and let's face it, Metallica being about as big as you can get in terms of heavy metal, anytime Metallica covers something, your status raises quite quickly in terms of popularity. But if Metallica wouldn't have covered them, I mean, Budgie would have been, far more obscure than they already are, which is still pretty obscure. Okay, so the fact that Budgie is undisputably an important foundational band to heavy music and what was to become heavy metal, yet they were never very popular, is this some kind of an injustice, right? Did Budgie deserve a greater audience? Okay, well, noting back to the aforementioned 5 categories that I talked about in part 2, it's not immediately evident how Budgie's fan base would grow if this was the case. So if Budgie was truly underrated, where is this untapped market that they could go to? Well, I don't think there really is one. Anyway, if you're interested in that 5-part category classes of music fans I put together, check out part 2 of this series where I talk about it in more detail. But just for now, I'll do a real fast little recap just for this particular presentation. So what I did is I took the music world and I grouped it into 5 categories based on how likely different people are to value heavy music. And really, I'll just say this really quickly, but the first category are of people that aren't into heavy music at all, or if they encounter heavy music, it's truly by accident. And of course, that's a big part of the world. There's another group of people who are maybe casual listeners of the odd heavy song, but they really just like the hits or the classics. So they know Smoke on the Water and Iron Man and Stairway to Heaven and songs like that, but they don't know anything beyond the hits, and they don't want to know anything beyond the hits in terms of heavy music. Then there's another group of people who are very serious music fans, but they're not heavy metal fans or hard rock fans. Maybe they like jazz or they like blues, or their emphasis is on country and Western or what have you. But for whatever reason, maybe because of a little bit of crossover into what they like the odd heavy metal album or the odd heavy metal band, right? But anybody in these top 3 categories are, these are not areas where Budgie is likely to grow any type of fan base if they truly were underrated. And they're not going to care, people in these categories, they're not going to care if a band's underrated or overrated because they're not into heavy music at all, right? So really we're talking, the only people that are, where Budgie could maybe expand their fan base a little bit would be either in category 4 or 5, because these people in this category are fans of heavy music. On one hand, it's people who like specific niches of heavy music. So category 4 would be people who like, say they really just listen to death metal, or they really just listen to thrash metal, or they're partial to just say 70s heavy music or something like that. And then category 5 are folks who like heavy music and they try to follow all the subgenres or as much as they can. And all eras, right? I mean, it's impossible to know it all because there's so much, but they have a very broad taste in heavy music, right? So that's where I was going with these categories. And so if we go back to the essay, right? So again, so when we fit that in with Budgie, right? If we consider those 5 categories, well, if Budgie really did deserve a greater audience, where is that greater audience going to be in those 5 categories, right? Budgie was exceedingly heavy, and they had no hits or anything that would be played on forums such as classic rock radio, right? So that completely eliminates a huge part of the population in categories 1 and 2. They're not, anybody who isn't into heavy music or only likes the hits, and I go to them, well, Budgie's really underrated, you should check them out. They're not going to care, right? This isn't their cup of tea. It's not the stuff they're going to listen to, right? So there's no potential for growth there. Right. I suppose there may be the exceptional jazz or blues fan, maybe, who might own a Budgie album or two. But as time progresses from Budgie's peak years in the 70s, very few folks in this third category are likely to purposefully track down a Budgie album at this point in time. So I don't think there's much growth potential in class 3 either. Very little, if any, right? And another thing I should mention too, as far as Budgie's audience should be much bigger, or people who think they're underrated, and where I'm not really buying that. It's notable that Budgie was not the type of band whose popularity could be amplified by notoriety. Let's face it, that happens sometimes. The members in Budgie lacked controversy, right? I mean, everything I've read about the band, they seemed like they were just normal, everyday blokes, as they'd say in England, right? They didn't have any wild Ozzy Osbourne type characters, and they were not particularly charismatic. I mean, Bert Shelley was a perfectly good frontman, but he didn't have the magnetism of, say, Robert Plant or David Lee Roth from Van Halen, or even, say, a James Hetfield from Metallica. They just weren't that type of band, right? Now, admittedly, the band did try to bring their sound closer in line with conventional expectations with their last album with John Thomas, so the Deliver Us from Evil album. And arguably, again, with their last album, You're All Living in Cuckoo Land, in spite of the title, the songs were actually not nearly as quirky, right? However, by this point, the Budgie brand had pretty much run its course, and there wasn't a lot of potential for growth, right? Any additional new fans that these albums might have attracted, I think, were equally offset by maybe a loss in some old-time fans, because frankly, there was a few things, Budgie was sweetening their sound a little bit. They added some keyboards. The songs were certainly simpler. They weren't as quirky, and the production values were a lot more sheen, right? So as a result, Budgie's wheelhouse has always been limited to really one of two areas. Either the very enthusiastic heavy music fan who is partial to obscure 70s bands, right? So that fan, okay, they're going to be into Budgie. Like, there's a lot of people who might want to explore, okay, the origins of heavy music or those early 70s heavy bands, right? And if you're that type of person, yeah, of course you're listening to Black Sabbath and Purple and Zeppelin, but you're seeking out other bands, and undoubtedly you know about Budgie, right? Or the generalist who has strong knowledge in all genres in hard rock and heavy metal, right? But really, we got to think about that. Again, when we look at the entire pie, if you like, of music fans, this is a really small slice of the population. It's going to comprise only a little bit of class 4 and 5, right? So Budgie's growth potential is not high, right? So the heavy enthusiast who actively seeks out the foundational stars of heavy metal will be a Budgie fan, or at least know about Budgie, right? And all indications are that Budgie is immensely respected by a small number of fans and actually a lot of artists, as we mentioned. And that seems about right, right? In other words, Budgie is far from underrated by those who should know about them. Yet anyone expecting anything else, that's just not realistic, right? So in spite of being integral to the building blocks of heavy music, right, that doesn't mean that Budgie should necessarily have a big audience because of that, right? And I think that makes sense. Their art is just too diverse, okay? Extreme light and shade within the albums, right? I mean, let me just say a word or two about that. Led Zeppelin is often, the epitome of a heavier band that incorporated light and shade into their sound, and to really good effect, right? That they could play really heavy stuff, but then they could play kind of folky ballads too, right? So they could run the gamut quite effectively. Budgie did that, but in a much more extreme way. When they were heavy, they were really heavy. In fact, I would argue in the early 70s, there was only one band on the planet that was heavier than Budgie, and that was Black Sabbath, right? But Budgie rivaled them every step of the way, in heaviness. But then all of a sudden, within the same album or sometimes within the same song, they would get really, really super light. Like bring out the acoustic guitar and Burke would just be, singing over top of it. You think all of a sudden you're listening to Joni Mitchell. I'm not kidding you. Like the extremes were massive, right? And let's face it, that's going to throw a lot of people off, that kind of diversity. That's not for everybody. It's certainly not for the mainstream. And it even was probably too weird for a lot of heavy fans, right? So just because Budgie was an integral band in the building blocks of heavy music, their art was just too diverse and the band was frankly just too quirky to ever get a wide mainstream audience. It just wouldn't make sense, right? So like I say, just because you're foundationally important doesn't mean you're underrated and that you deserve a bigger audience, right? And in Budgie's case, and I would argue most bands like Budgie, their audience, the band is fairly obscure and their audience is fairly small, and that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so just to wrap this up, I'm going to quickly mention a couple other bands that I think are exceptionally important in terms of their foundational value, but that a lot of people like to call underrated because of that. But I think that their small audiences are actually quite logical and justified. Okay. So as I was saying, many other foundational bands share similarities with the Budgie situation. The overzealous fan bemoans their lack of attention, but upon closer inspection, the achievement of only modest levels of popularity is completely reasonable. I'm going to mention three quick bands. Second generation doom metal stalwarts, Pentagram, thrash legends, Exodus, proto-prog metal act, Captain Beyond. Those three come to mind, and there's lots of others we could talk about too, but we'll leave it at those three. Now, the few reviewers who have documented Pentagram's evolution from basically being almost a completely anonymous band in the late 70s to semi-obscurity in the 1980s and beyond often point out their influence on subsequent doom and stoner metal bands, right? There's no question about that. Pentagram was a huge influence on a lot of doom metal bands that were to follow. Maybe only Black Sabbath had greater influence on doom metal. I mean, and I know that's saying a load, but that's how important Pentagram probably was to a lot of other bands, but not necessarily to fans, right? I mean, there are certain fans that understand how great Pentagram is as a doom metal band, but widestream, acceptance has always been elusive, right? Regarding Exodus, it's been argued that the so-called big four of thrash metal, which is Metallica, Megadeth, Slayer, and Anthrax, should actually be the big five. And that fifth band should be Exodus, right? But in terms of popularity, though, this would be hard to defend. For foundational importance, I would completely agree with that. Exodus is probably every bit as important from a foundational perspective as the big four. But from a popularity perspective, they are many tiers down, right? So to call them big in terms of big five seems kind of illogical. Captain Beyond released their first self-titled album in 1972 and immediately forged a style of progressive music that was much heavier than other prog acts of the day. So compared them to, say, Yes or Jethro Tull or somebody like that. And importantly, they did this several years before Rush became famous for pioneering the prog metal subgenre. I mean, Rush is an amazing band, one of my all-time favorites, but they're pretty much, they're sort of the granddaddies, if you like, of prog metal, or a lot of people see them that way. But a lot of people, don't seem to understand that Captain Beyond started several years before Rush. They were doing what Rush was doing, but, a few years before. Captain Beyond starts in 72. Rush, his first album, was put out in 74, right? And they don't really get into sort of the proggy stuff until probably their third album, Caress of Steel, right? Maybe a little bit on the second album, Fly By Night, right? But really, at that point, we're talking 75 at the earliest. Well, Captain Beyond was doing that sort of stuff 3 years earlier, right? So very few seem to understand Captain Beyond's foundational value, or they don't connect with their considerable compositional talents as well. So real fast, again, I'll sort of point out, like I did for Budgie, but I won't go into the same amount of detail, where the key foundational value is for these three bands, right? Okay, so for Pentagram, I would say their key foundational albums are these three, right? The first album, well, I'm going to call it the first album. It sort of isn't, for reasons I'll get to in a second. But the album called Pentagram, which is also known as Relentless, that was put out in 1984. Day of Reckoning, 1987, and then Be Forewarned in 1994. The only constant member of Pentagram is the vocalist Bobby Liebling. Okay, but on these three albums, you've got on guitar Victor Griffin, who to me is one of the greatest doom metal guitarists I've ever heard. I mean, of course, he's not Tony Iommi, but he might be the next thing to it. I know, big statement to make, but as far as doom metal goes, this guy's tone was just unbelievable. And Pentagram had a huge impact, like I say, it tended to be on other bands and a small subset of fans, but certainly not widespread metal fans, right? And so that was definitely foundationally important, these three albums. I'm going to say probably foundationally important was their really early stuff, but it never got released on album, or at least not beyond official releases. These were demos that circulated in the 70s that were bootlegged, and the underground knew about them. So there's maybe some foundational importance there, but they didn't reach widespread audiences at all. Well, these really didn't either, but at least they had official releases, right? I mean, it was only it was into the 2000s where this early 1970s stuff actually even got released. But again, note how early Pentagram was actually in existence, right? 1972. So again, keeping in mind as a benchmark, Black Sabbath's first album was 1970. Pentagram was kind of contemporaries of Black Sabbath, only very few people knew about them. Anything after I would say after Be Forewarned, 1994, I don't think has a lot of foundational importance, but they're still great albums. Pentagram put out a lot of great albums over the years, and I like them all, frankly, and some of them are really spectacular. But I don't know that they have the foundational importance of these three in particular, and maybe even the early stuff. Okay, Exodus, an incredible thrash metal band. From a foundational standpoint, I would argue just as important as Slayer and Megadeth and Metallica. Obviously, popularity-wise, nowhere close, right? And rightfully so, as I'll mention in a second. Definitely their absolute drop-dead classic, I should say, in terms of foundational importance is the very first one, Bonded by Blood. The material on Bonded by Blood had been written as early as Metallica's Kill 'Em All of 1983. It just took Exodus a few years to actually get stuff out, which probably hurt their progress too. The only constant in Exodus through the years has been guitarist Gary Holt, who also, people might know, that was what played in Slayer for the last part of Slayer's career. He replaced Jeff Hanneman for the last few tours, as well as the Lost album, right? But his baby, Gary Holt's baby, has always been Exodus. And on the first album, Bonded by Blood, original vocalist Paul Bailiff, that's the one and only album he was on, other than a live album, but it's the only studio album he was on. And then probably possibly foundationally important would be the next three albums, right? So you got 1987, Pleasures of the Flesh, 1989, Fabulous Disaster, and 1990, Impact is Imminent. Okay. I don't think any of these albums are nearly as important from a foundational standpoint as Bonded by Blood was, but they're reasonably important. Steve Sosa takes over in vocals at this point. He's actually become, I would say, the voice of Exodus, although he hasn't been consistently with them all through time, but I think he's probably become the voice. Exodus is still continuing. I mean, they've put out albums since then. I don't think they have the same foundational importance. Persona Non Gratis, actually, an album was just put out last year. It's spectacular, right? But again, I don't call any of this foundationally important. It was definitely their first album and arguably their next three, right? And then we got Captain Beyond, proto-prog, or proto-prog metal band, I guess I would call it. They have a very small discography. I would say definitely foundational, though, would be the first two. The 1972 self-titled Captain Beyond, no exaggeration. This album would be in my top 10 favorite albums by anybody. I think it's that great. And by the way, I'm not alone there. When I read stuff about this album or get other people's opinions, you see chats and stuff on it. A lot of people, the few people that know about it really, really get it, right? So definitely Captain Beyond's first album would be foundationally important. Probably the second album too. I don't think it has near the impact of the first one, but still a lot of impact. It's called Sufficiently Breathless. It was put out the next year. Possibly foundational also would be their third and last album called Dawn Explosion. Okay, so just to wrap this up, go back to the essay. Okay, so make no mistake, people who do like Pentagram, Exodus, and or Captain Beyond really like them, right? And in my view, for good reason. They're amazing bands, right? There's no question. Yet, popularity killing characteristics such as lineup instabilities, and again, there's so many different lineups in all of these bands, lack of widely recognizable songs, there are no hits, arguably no classics. I mean, Toxic Waltz for Exodus. But again, you'd have to be a hardcore thrash fan to call that a classic, right? To the mainstream, there are no classics here. There are no hits, right? Uncompromising heaviness, at least within the subgenres, and blind devotion to innovative art above all else, quite logically kept Pentagram, Exodus, and Captain Beyond well below the top tiers in commercial appeal within their subgenres, right? In short, only small cross sections of music enthusiasts, largely within classes 4 and 5, if we go back to that typology, appreciate these bands, and it's hard to imagine how this could be otherwise, right? So again, as I was saying, just because you are incredibly important from a foundational standpoint to the creation of heavy metal, to the creation of hard rock, to the creation of specific subgenres, to the creation of specific eras, right? Doesn't mean that you're necessarily underrated or that you deserve a wider audience. You can be foundationally important and still very obscure. In fact, often that's the case, right? Sometimes the true innovators within a scene or within a movement are kind of ahead of their time in some ways. And it takes bands that sort of build on what they did to popularize it a little bit, and they're the ones that kind of break it open. So this is really not that unusual. But it doesn't mean the band is underrated in terms of they should have a much bigger audience. And I would argue, whether it be Budgie, whether it be Pentagram, Exodus, and Captain Beyond, the audiences they have, given the music they play, is completely logical. They're great, but they're not underrated. And they quite justifiably have small audiences as a result. Okay, so there are many other examples of foundational heavy artists that are perceived as criminally underrated, but with little justification for such well-meaning claims. And if you want to hear more, just ask me, I'll tell you more, but I think that's enough for now, all right? So I hope you'll join me for part 4 in this series, where I'm going to talk about, and this might be the part that most people can really latch on to when we say, I can't believe this band doesn't have a wider audience, because I'm going to talk about heavy bands that are not only heavy, but they're really accessible. In other words, they have a lot of catchy songs. They work with a lot of melody. They're not as quirky as Budgie or as heavy as Pentagram or as fast as Exodus. So people scratch their chins and go, well, yeah, they're heavy, but I mean, they're so catchy. Why don't they have a wider audience, right? So this might really hit the nail on the head. And I'm still going to make the same argument that even though they're catchy, that doesn't mean they should necessarily have a big audience. And the band I'm going to really talk about in this section is King's X, right? A really interesting band, a really great band, perhaps the epitome of underrated to a lot of people. But I would say they're not really underrated. There's a reason why King's X's audience is actually quite restricted. So I hope you'll tune in for that. Thank you, though, for listening to any parts of this or anything I might ramble on about. I really appreciate it. If you're putting any time into this, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. And have a terrific day, evening, night, whenever you're watching this. Take care.